Welcome back to the Gleam Fishing Channel. I'm Darren Guard, and today we are very lucky to have someone that is pretty well known in the sector, Richard Wells. So, welcome, Richard.
Thanks. Lovely to be here. Thanks, Darren.
No, it's certainly an honour to have you here. And I'm just looking at your run sheet. You've been around a wee while. That's not judging on your age, but I see you're the winner of the Seafood Sustainability Award. You've spent 20 odd years protecting seabirds and mammals, which is absolutely a worthy cause. You worked, I guess, furiously to reduce the bycatch of protected species, and you developed and implemented the Deepwater Protected Species Bycatch Liaison Program. So you've had a lot to do with protecting marine species, and we'll definitely get into that probably as part of another podcast, which will be something really special and worth looking at, I'd imagine.
It was a big part of my life, but only a part of it, obviously. On that award, by the way, I'd like to state for the record that I took the award on the backs of thousands who did the work, and so straight away acknowledge the people at sea and ashore who funded and fronted and did the work. That's what it was about. So I was just waving the flag, really, but of course someone gets the medal and it was me, but it was everybody else that did the work. Thanks.
Same old story, isn't it? But absolutely. But I mean, look, you've certainly been leading in that area. But one of the things that we're actually going to talk about today is we've had a lot of our viewers have really enjoyed the history of early seafood industry and boats and life in the sounds and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess, your time and background around the sounds, your family's involvement, because obviously your name is sort of synonymous with the sounds in French Pass area. I spoke to my father, obviously, who you know pretty well, and mentioned I was doing one with you, and he, funnily, he sort of says, "Oh, old Big Coat." And I said, "Oh, old Big Coat. Where's I've heard this nickname my whole life is Big Coat. What's this Big Coat thing about?" And he said to me, he says, "Oh, I remember Richard when he was a young fella when we were actually unloading the Gleam at the French Pass Wharf, and quite often they'd see you and your mates and your family sort of kicking around, kicking the can or whatever you're doing." And he said he remembers when you started on the Tequila. So you fished for a while on the Tequila with our good friend Colin McCauley. Yep. He was saying that you were fishing down in Picton there one day, and it was freezing cold, and you were a young fella, and apparently they got it and unloaded, and you headed uptown and came back with a coat that was many sizes too large, which supposedly you wore all scallop season, hence your nickname Big Coat.
Yeah, well, I haunted the Salvation Army shops and was notorious for the dead man's clothes. So I'd go and buy a suit for $1. So that was a suit coat for 50 cents and a pair of trousers for 50 cents. And when they wore out, I threw them away. So I lived in a suit coat.
Yeah, well, that'll be the name, I would have thought. And hey, it works well though, because you need something decent, thick, and something that's not too expensive when you're working on a boat. So,
and that's called worse things.
Yeah, I would have thought.
Sure.
And I know a lot of fishermen that have had worse nicknames, so I'd take that as a badge of honour, to be fair. So I want to just dwell a little bit on your background, like your history, and I know you're passionate around about the French Pass and a lot of that sort of region. So, you're part of the Wells family, which is a well-known sort of fishing and farming family in the region. So, where and how did it begin from you? I mean, how did you go from, a young fella all the way through to, one of New Zealand's probably greatest and most respected marine mammal and protected species, I guess protectors. How did it all come about?
Well, again, it goes back to ancestry and upbringing, and we, a lot of Wells is in the Sounds because my ancestors, my great-great-grandfather and grandmother lived on Wells Road, as it happens, up on the hill here. So it was that coincidence.
Yeah, I got to say, that must have been a coincidence, but you've been around long enough.
No, it certainly wasn't. It was named after them.
Yeah.
And they had 9 sons. So that was a way of getting the surname spread around the region. But also they had a daughter, Maria, and the way the Wells family became connected with French Pass, which we have been since the 1870s, was through a maritime tragedy. And your work in maritime safety. So, take some plaudits for that. I'll throw some back to you. And which you always mention in these podcasts, and I like that you always play safe, get home safe at the end of these things. But Arthur Elmsley, who was a whaler, and there's another connection from Port Underwood, I think, but he ended up moving to French Pass, bought land, and set up a station where he wanted to trade fish and do a bit of farming and stuff. He needed help, so he wrote to England and said, I'm looking for a couple of bright young guys to come here and help me. And 2 Webbers responded, brothers, and one of them was married with a child and the other one was single. They came out here to New Zealand, emigrated, and started living at French Pass and working in this little new business that Arthur Elmsley was starting after a lifetime, essentially, of whaling. And one day, tragically, it's kind of a lot of romance in these stories, but a lot of tragedy, the married guy and his wife and child came out in a small boat, and we'll talk about small boats and where they fit in the society down there later, but they sailed from French Pass to Nelson to do their business or see a doctor or whatever. That's what you had to do, and it would have been small. It would have been 20 foot, I'm guessing. Might have had a sail. They may have rowed it. They often rowed to Gazelle's, and they'd pull the boat up, sleep under it, and then come on the next day. It was all very slow, dangerous work, basically. But they capsized out here off the Boulder Bank in one of those short, shitty seas that we know can happen off the Boulder Bank. The boat capsized and they were all lost and remain lost. So the other poor young Webber, fresh from England, on his own, all of a sudden his family connection gone, came to Nelson and spent days and weeks prowling the Boulder Bank and talking to all of the ships in the harbour, hoping that someone had seen a body or a live person, whatever he was looking for. Closure, they call it nowadays. My great-grandfather was selling milk to the ships on the wharves. He was going up and down with his milk tunes and sees this young fella, takes pity on him, takes him in and says, you can stay in our house. And the rest, as they say, is history. He married the eldest daughter, Maria Wells, moved to French Pass. They convinced my great-grandfather to build them a house, and her brothers followed, and one of her brothers was my great-grandfather. They installed at Waikawa Bay. So we became French Pass people because 3 people tragically drowned off the Boulder Bank. That's in a small boat.
Wow.
And it struck me after watching your podcast with Jack and thinking about boats. That fact only struck me then, and yet it's been with me all my life. So it's kind of cool and kind of sad, but it's real.
Yeah, well, that's real history. That's really interesting. And I guess just going back, I mean, your family, our family have known each other for a while, but you mentioned heading from the French Pass to Nelson in a, 18 or 20 footer, because, that's what the Guards did as well before they actually purchased the Gleam.
Yep.
And I guess to give it some context, I mean, that's it's a 40 to 50 mile sort of a distance.
Yep. Over one of the nastier bits of water between, the southern end of D'Urville Island and Delaware Bay.
Absolutely.
Pretty nasty.
Yeah, especially off Okuri. That's a few tragedies there, which we'll lead into. And, I know it takes the Gleam here approximately 5 hours to get down to the pass. So that just gives some people, and that's at about 7.5, 8 knots if you're going downhill. And you've got the tide and the wind and everything else in your favour. But it's quite a distance for a 20-foot vessel. And as you said, the sea can be pretty gnarly, particularly when you've got that sort of westerly or northwest coming out from Golden Bay off places like Okuri and Cape Susie and that, So
big tide, when the big tide comes through, tide coming this way and northwest blowing up, that's when it's short, sharp and nasty, all right. Time meant nothing to them, of course.
Yeah, it didn't have the time pressures, That's probably a good point. And I saw so they settled down there. And look, you've sent through some really cool photos of, like, for example, some of the early Wells picnics and that down around the area, and some of the small boats, and they were all around the 1900s. So what were they sort of doing in the area, and then sort of you came along, and how did that sort of come about?
Things didn't change for a long time. It was a small boat society, and the Marlborough Sounds didn't become a small boat society again until mussel farming started, which was kind of nice. That suddenly people did things in boats again, but everybody travelled in small boats. Meeting up with your neighbours was really important. it ended up that everybody within rowing distance was related, because if you
No
you were
television.
if you were courting, you got in a dinghy and rowed somewhere,
Yeah.
So that was always my view on that, and so there's a huge amount of intermarriage and relations in the Sounds, and we'll be related somewhere if we dug deep enough, we'd find it. But the society down there, they'd all gather and congregate in certain places. So it'd be the Hopi Sports up in the Sounds, the inner Sounds, and the sports days and fairs that they held, which included chopping and floral arrangement competitions and bake-offs around 1900. And everybody from Tennyson Inlet right through the Pelorus there would all come round to Waikawa Bay, and they'd stay there for 3 or 4 days and make a thing of it and sleep in wool sheds and stuff. And I've got the written history of that from one of my ancestors, which I'm going to develop and publish, so you'll be able to read all about it. But they were big things. And then the following year they'd swap, and then everyone would go to Tennyson Inlet, Tuna Bay or somewhere. So they took turns at hosting, and they made it a real thing. It wasn't just drive over there for 2 hours and come back. They'd stay there for days and eat and drink and chop things. And so that old photo with all those little boats in the bay there, and you imagine the worry about the weather and getting home and all the rest of it. But they all had their bonnets on, and the men had their waistcoats on, and they had a good time. So it was an important part of the fabric of society. It brought them all together. And that continued. The Hopi Sports continued for a long time. Te Waka Sports still run, and people are coming back in boats. The old fishing families, the Terrys and the Astons, are coming back to the Te Waka Sports in their boats. And it's lovely to see that it's almost come a full circle again. So, but with no roads, boats were it. Walking was hard, so you took a boat. And the community revolved around their boats. They named their boats themselves, treasured them. That was their source of safety, their source of commerce. Small boats coming in, trading, it was everything.
Well, it was your older year car, wasn't it? Really, largely,
Absolutely.
it was absolutely same with. Like, I know when the family bought the Gleam, it changed the fortunes. Usually, I mean, it was you could get to Wellington, you could ship fish and product, you could get to Nelson, and it brought in quite a significant income over a period of time. So.
Well, I've been to Pukatea Bay, where your family came from. I went there shearing once when the Lionses were living there, and spent a day shearing in the boat building shed.
Yep.
It was my only time there, but there's no way out of there except on a boat. The hill goes straight up behind you, and you're a long way from anyone unless you've got a boat.
Yeah, no, pretty remote for sure, Pukatea Bay. So where were you? So talk a little bit about you, Richard. So where were you actually born? Where did you go to school? What was your first job? How did you sort of end up in the fishing industry? So your background.
So I was born in Blenheim, because by the time I came along, there was a road of sorts, and we'll talk about the road later, because your grandfather and my grandfather were both very involved in that space. And but my eldest brother, he came home by boat. So I was right on that cusp of being a boat society and a road society. And the world changed when the road came in, and it became very different. So, but yeah, I was born in Blenheim, grew up in Waikawa Bay, had the Weber family living next door. So they were our cousins from way back, and all very focused on sheep farming. All the families down there, they either fished exclusively, the Terrys, the Astons, the Lionses, the Gazelles before my time. So you were fishing people and the Macauleys, or you mixed it up. The Macauleys mixed it up. They were farming and fishing in Waitāta. And then there were the true blue farmers, and we had sheep shit on the brain. That was us, right? We knew people were fishing, but we had nothing. We never made money out of that. So and that had been generational from my great grandfather's time. We never swerved from it. So I came back. We went to school at French Pass. Wonderful. 12 kids, all grades. So the whole school had 12 children in it, all related. All the kids in my class I was related to. Very Chatham Islands, people laugh about it. I now look back at the strength that you get from that sort of a society. We'd be down fishing off the wharf at lunchtime, then all day. If the teacher would let us, we built spotty traps. We did nature walks, which meant fool around in the bush all day. We had a ball, and it was an upbringing that made you independent and to a degree confident. Your uncle Chris, when I was out on the Dorothy May one day trawling in the bay, he looked at me, and I was steering the boat and repair trawling, and I'd never been involved in steering a boat by radar line in my life. And he looked at me and says, "You've never done that." I said, "No." He says, "People from French Pass can do anything." And in a way, he was right. We were relatively poorly educated, but we were taught how to fend for ourselves and ask for help and get on. So, and that schooling down there was wonderful in that way. Academically, it was awful. And I couldn't add fractions when I went to college. But so then come out to Nelson Boys, like most people did, because it was a boarding school and you had to, and hated it. I loved the academic. And I hated the boarding school life, quit at the end of school cert, couldn't get out of there fast enough. Back down the farm, worked on the farm for several years. Did a stint on Pātuki out the end of Derville with my uncles, and that's, you think French Pass is isolated and you know nothing till you go to Pātuki, and when you could look up and see the lights of Wellington, so you know you're closer to that, look south and see the lights of Wellington. But during that time in my early teens, late teens, I started to see these boats going backwards and forwards through the Current Basin, and they weren't the little boats, they were big white boats. The Hawi and the Wanaka, fishing for skegs, sister ships, with a very distinctive motor in them, so I knew them at night. I could tell who they were by their sound, and the Whitby and Fifeshire in particular, but there were other bigger ones as well. And what I didn't know was orange ruffian things were being discovered, and all of a sudden something new was happening, and I could see it. Same time, serendipitously, dear old Colin McCauley, who lived in Sissy Bay, straight over the hill, and just had a new boat built by your grandfather, the Tequila, was casting around for a deckhand, and my brother spent a fair bit of time on the boat, probably a year maybe, and then he got sick of it, and so I stepped in and had a go. So I think I was the third deckhand on the Tequila, and I was shocked and amazed at this lifestyle and the things you saw and the seabirds and the it was just close but so different to what you see from land, but the people and the rafting up at night with Mike Harris on the Gypsy and Mike McLaren on the Pioneer too, and so meeting these people who are a part of this whole different fraternity with a whole different philosophy and sense of humour, and I was just really attracted to it, and spent every night, like you and I are sitting here in the Gleam, we'd be in a warm, cosy wheelhouse of the Tequila in Port Hardy, or who knows where around the coast of Derville, or in the wheelhouse of another boat, because we'd tie up with them and sharing stories and having a beer. And I was just absolutely attracted to it, and I was smitten by it.
And getting paid to do it.
And scalloping, the money was good, and butterfish seat netting wasn't quite so good, but I didn't care. I was besotted by it. So when went back to farming, because we ended up out here in Nelson trawling and pair trawling things, and we towed a net round that didn't work for many months, and I made no money, and so I went back shearing because I didn't put some money back in the coffers. But I left the scene reluctantly. I was living on the boat here in the old frog pond as well, which wasn't easy. I was the only deckhand in the whole of Port Nelson, still living on the boat day to day, and I was within 100 metres of the Tasman Tavern, which wasn't beneficial to the health.
No.
Smoking, it was 3 packets of Rothmans a day, so it wasn't a lifestyle that was good for me. So I bailed out, went back farming, but I stayed attracted when Rogernomics came and really shifted the farming industry sideways with all the subsidies gone and stuff. I marched on Parliament, my only formal protest, but we didn't set fire to anything. And I saw an advert in the paper for the Maritime College in Australia, so I thought that looks interesting, and I applied for it. And despite leaving school early and all such, they accepted me because I'd stuck with a correspondence course in sheep farming. So they said, here's a guy that can stick anything. We'll take a punt on this New Zealander who's got a wife and child, and he's approaching 30 as an adult student into the course. And the rest, as they say, is history in terms of where I ended up in the fishing industry, which I suspect should be another podcast. But,
absolutely.
But that sense of community and strength of community, bound by boats. Like in England, they were bound by their little trains, and the Western US by their stagecoaches and stuff. That was the tie that binds in terms of that community down there, and the risks that were involved in it, and the tragedies that occurred were all around people drowned down there. Kids drowned off wharves, people drowned on boats, people drowned in French Pass. Fishermen were lost on Terry and Palliser Bay, and that's the way people died down there, unless it was in childbirth or appendicitis. So that was the risk, but
Yep.
that was the deal.
Risk and reward, isn't it, really?
Very much. And needs must.
That's right. And you look at the things like the comradeship and the relationships, and you see, all the skills that you were taught, hands on, as I've said, if you really want to get a rocket to Mars, then chuck a fisherman in there, because give them a spanner and a screwdriver and a beer and they'll be there in a matter of hours, because they can just do a little bit of everything. Just the multitude of skills, you think even on a boat like this, or the Tequila that you spent time on, I mean, you had to be, as the skipper or the crew, you had to be a plumber, an electrician, a fisherman, a net
cook,
mender,
as I remember.
a cook. Yeah, a cook. So,
toilet cleaner.
Yeah, toilet
we
cleaner.
Had a toilet.
Yeah, all of those things on the mighty old Tequila. So you spend a bit of time butterfishing with Colin McCauley. So talk about that. What's the process of butterfishing all about? What did you do back then?
It's a huge loss that Colin, I believe and suspect, never wrote anything down about that. He was a walking encyclopedia of butterfish sets. So, in very old school, taught by his dad from the I'm Alone and his uncle Vern on the Eastern Star. And the only person he feared on the sea was Vern in the Eastern Star. And if we went out to do butterfishing around D'Urville for the week and he saw the masthead of the Eastern Star coming up, he'd be in an absolute panic because he didn't want Vern following him around. But anyway, he made his own nets. He soaked them in boiled onion skins to get the brown colour. He painted the floats brown by hand. We had 15 nets. I think they were a certain length by law. But we had 15 nets on the boat, that was it. And we towed the popper around, which I'm assuming his dad built. Yep. I know that his dad hand-carved the kahikatea oar, that was the big steering oar at the back, like those Aussie surf boats, little wee putt engine in it. And that was the dory that he would go in very, very close and set these butterfish nets. But that was the operation of it. This extraordinary part of it was in his mind. And he told me, and I'm making up a number here, but he had literally hundreds of what he called sets in his mind. No GPS, no plotter, no nothing. In his head, from the oral history and experience from his dad, every bay, every cove around the Jags, the Chetwoods, the D'Urville Island, all the way down to the Gazelles, all the way around to Cape Jackson, he knew butterfish sets. And that meant where and the angle of the net.
Yeah, the angle and the tide and the weed. Where's the weed?
Where the weed was.
Weed? Yep.
And I never put a float at one end because he didn't want someone else to be able to see the angle.
Yeah.
So he'd never put a float at each end because then you could determine the angle based on even if there's an offset, right?
Yeah.
So it was very special to him. And he would sometimes shift them. So he'd set it for 2 hours and then go and shift it microscopically because the tide would have swung. But it was all what time of the month, moon phase, what month. It was a winter fishery, but they were extraordinarily detailed map in his head, and he would have written none of it down. And maybe it's a good thing it's lost. I don't know. But he could keep that in his mind. Incredible memory and intelligence on that fishing stuff. And so we'd get up. It was a gentleman's fishery because you didn't have to get up till about 10 o'clock in the morning, and because nothing happened in the morning. All the fishing started about 3 or 4 o'clock, the golden hour when you're hunting. So about 3 or 4 o'clock, you'd start bustling around. Would be on whichever side of D'Urville the weather suited. So southeast would be round the front, and northwest would be round the back. Stevens Island, whenever it was flat calm, bolt to Stevens Island because it was a great fishery. But so rarely was the weather good that wherever you were, if you two calm days, you'd be out there on the weather side of the Rangitoto Islands down there. So very weather dependent. He'd start bundling nets into the popper, leave me in charge of the Tequila, which for the first few times was pretty daunting, to be suddenly in charge of this beautiful boat, and I'm just a peasant farmer. And he'd go right in near shore and be running these nets out the back of the boat, pipe in his mouth. The only time he paused was to put another match to it. It was good at night because I could see the sparks coming out, so I knew where he was because there's not much else to tell me.
No lights.
Set all the nets before dark and then haul them very soon after dark. So they'd be in the water by 4 o'clock, and in May, June, they'd be coming out of the water and hopefully everything back on deck by 8 or 9 o'clock, following him down the coast in the dark, lining stars up on outlines of hills to try and tell, so I could work out where I was. trying to stand off. He'd wave a torch if he was worried about me getting too close to shore, which sometimes I misinterpreted for him asking me to come and pick him up because it was the same signal. So we had a few anxious moments between us. He was anxious about his boat. But then you get these nets with mostly butterfish in them, beautiful clean fish, lovely to clean, no spines. Bin them up. Good night, you get 30 bins. Bad night, you get 2. And you'd count the fish in each net. It was the only fishery I've ever been in where you counted the number of fish in each. It was a fish number game, like the guys with the crabs. So it's cool.
No, it's definitely. I remember. I did a bit of butterfishing with Colin as well, and I know sometimes. Yeah, it was all quite secretive, eh? Like sometimes wouldn't put a float on the end, they'd tie a stick.
Yeah,
or a log or a bit of driftwood. So anyone would just see a bit of driftwood and go, there's nothing there. But because we did a bit too, actually, we did a bit on the Gleam. Dad did quite a bit. And I still actually remember when you talked about dyeing the nets. I remember when Dad, because in fact, under his house, there's still quite a few original butter nets with the old cork floats and a little bit of the lead, wrapped around the lead line. And I remember actually when he was making them, this is a long time ago, but we had an old, the old Ringer washing machine. Yep. And he dyed it in that. I still remember that. I don't know what he used for dye, but I remember Mum not being overly delighted as he poured these nets and the dye into the old washing machine. But yeah, they came out pretty good. Like I said, they're still under the house. So I guess going back to, Colin was a great mate of our families, and the McCauleys, we're all sort of one and the same, all bleed the same colour for sure, the same history. So you talked earlier on about the old roading board and that. So obviously, Jack Guard and the Guards were around French Pass, and we lived over at Poketia Bay, and you were over in your way. So we talked about the road earlier on in the wharf. So I understand that there was so the likes of Jack, and was it your father? They were on the roading board or the wharfage board or something of that nature.
Yeah, it was quite a unique situation down there, and it still is in a way, in that the boat ramps and the wharves are still considered part of the road by Marlborough Council, but because they were such important linkages to connecting to D'Urville Island and everywhere else, so the wharf is still managed by Marlborough Roads. So that's that connection, but way back then, they were such important community assets that they were basically looked after by the locals, or managed by the locals. They didn't belong to the council; they had their own association. And what drove the road thing was the fact that shortly after World War II, with a great reshift and all sorts of economics, and there's a lot of poverty. I won't say poverty, hard times for the country, and England was on its knees financially, not buying our stuff, etc. And the ferries, which had been a mainstay, so we talked about the small boats earlier, but from the 30s onwards, there's these big steamers going backwards and forwards through French Pass, probably earlier than that, and they were big enough to be able to cope with it. Even one or two came unstuck, and you can go and Google it. You'll see a few with their bows up on the rocks there, which must have been quite frightening. But the word came out that all those ferries were going to be stopped. So the ferry from Wellington to Nelson, which was the ferries, which were the mainstay for people to go. So all of my parents, both mother and father, they would go over to Waikawa Bay, go out to the current basin in a small boat, hold up a lantern to hail the ferry, which would stop in the current basin, drop down a bosun's ladder, and they would scramble up, pull in their suitcase and go to boarding school. That's how you got to boarding school, right? And if
hailing a taxi, isn't it?
By hailing a taxi, holding up a lantern. And if you wanted to see your accountant, your lawyer and your dentist, you'd normally go to Wellington or Nelson. My family used to go to Wellington because it was just as close. But you caught the ferry. So when they knew the ferries were going, everyone realised, different world, we're going to be on our own here. All of our commerce is going to die. We've got no way of getting anywhere, for our safety, for health, for education, everything. We're going to lose it. So the people think we're going to have a road. It's the only choice. So they joined up and fought hard, and Jack was right into that. And it's interesting because he was never going to get a road connected to his place, but he still saw it.
He did it for the French Pass.
Exactly. That was a community thing for him. That's not, I'm going to get a road to my house. It's the district needs a road because we're not going to have a proper boat or boat service. And so he and my grandfather were leaders in that. I think my grandfather did. This is grandfather Leo, on my mother's side, did most of the work on the in Wellington lobbying and stuff. He's a very well educated guy. Did a lot of reading, so he would have been the letter writer. But Jack was the pusher, because I've read the history of that group, and Jack was the only member of the group that attended every meeting they held. And so there's a message about his dedication and commitment. My dad was on it, but he was a boy. Later on, he was a Marlborough District Councillor and stuff, but he was the boy on it. But they, interestingly, because they were their own association, they had to levy the district to get the money. So you imagine, a bit like a fishing industry association, getting levies from their members. So it wasn't Marlborough District Council seeking rates from the landowners down there. A community group was doing it. So you can imagine the tensions that could cause, where your neighbour hasn't got the money to pay. And, it wasn't a lot of money, but they were having to levy their own neighbours and relations to get the money together to make the contribution for that stuff. So it was a big, long battle and a win. And in 1954, they, the Bryant boys, the ex-logging family from Rye Valley, broke all KPIs known to man in terms of how much road you could cut how cheaply and how much gelignite you could use, by the way. That was their other KPI that they broke, to get that road from Okiwi Bay all the way through to French Pass. And, of course, it's still there, and recreational fishers and everybody else use it all the time now. But that was a pioneering effort, and it altered the fabric of society there. But the far-seeing, the elders of the district really grunted that up.
Well, I guess that was, you talk about Jack or Granddad, I mean, that's why he built boats into his 90s, right? He was pretty determined and never... I've actually seen quite a few letters, and he was involved in a few politics. He was obviously in, I think, the earlier fishing industry board, and involved in a lot of groups, and he had amazing handwriting, to be fair, like really flash, like way better than I've ever had. So I've seen quite a few letters. I actually have got the letter at home where he wrote to the Marine Department in Wellington, which, as I said, he didn't really like at the time, because all of a sudden they invented surveys and requirements that he had to follow. And he wrote a handwritten letter about the Gleam when they wanted to convert it from passenger to fishing. So he wrote this beautiful letter, dear sir, and he sent the plans in, and all sorts of sketches, and and the letter came back. I've got the official letter that authorised the Gleam to go from pure passenger to fishing, and I've actually got every survey certificate and letter from the Marine Department for this boat from about probably 1950, something of that nature. So it's comes with quite a bit of history. So
we tend to forget that our ancestors spent a lot of time writing. We text and send messages and stuff like that.
Think we've had a hard day.
They all knew how to write a proper letter with a yours sincerely, yours faithfully. I haven't got it, but I know that my grandfather, in terms of the road, as chair of the road committee, in the end, Marlborough District Council said, we can't keep going like this. We should be in charge of that road. But it was late on. It was in the early 60s, I think, that they were basically told, you're going to have to hand it over to us now. And grandfather Leo wrote a letter saying, I fear we will rue the day that we lose control of what work and maintenance and stuff is done on this road. And I could say publicly that some of those fears have come to pass, but so it goes. But that jump shift from the road and the following one, when the electricity arrived, where we really became a normal society, because you could have a freezer and lights and stuff, versus just generators and all of those things. They were the community social changes that really affected the place. But I wind the clock back to that boating tragedy of for the Webbers, the first of the French Pass Webber family, and then they were reasonably constant, because that was in 1874 that I think Maria and Mr. Webber got married. So it was, that boat tragedy was about 1870, but in 1884. I don't know how long they've had a beacon in French Pass, and then the lighthouse on shore. The beacon's the one out in the water. But in 1884, they established the lighthouse keeper's cottage. So for the first time, they could have that manned, and therefore someone there constantly checking the light, I'm not sure whether they had a time ball or a flag that they, not a time ball, but a flag that they'd put up to show the tide so the steamers could come up. Because even then the tide changes near a bit and it's not quite on the clock, you know, and incredibly important that was right. And also just so that the vessels would know if someone was coming the other way. I mean, you call up on the radio now, but...
It's pretty narrow.
It looks narrow from the road, and when you get in it, it's even narrower, is my experience. And the safest place passaging through there, and done it in the Tequila many times, is so close you can see the gape and the mussels that are underwater, you know, because the least current is right against the edge where the boundary layer is. But boy, you're literally looking at barnacles on the rocks, and watching out for the little back flushes. But when they built that lighthouse keeper's cottage, I called it a cottage, it was an incredible asset to the district, because of the dependence on the shipping. Therefore, the safety of shipping mattered to farmers as much as it mattered to fishermen and everybody else. And so I've been to Archives New Zealand because I've suddenly become interested in the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Because the older you get, the more you look back, not forward, because looking forward's not quite as enlightening. And so I'm digging into this lighthouse cottage because Dock have mothballed it at the moment because it got damaged in the big floods there 3 years ago, and I was worried they might pull it down, but they're not, which is good. They've mothballed it and they're trying to think about it. So I dug into its history, and in Archives New Zealand in Wellington, there's 20 odd boxes of files just relating to the French Pass Lighthouse and the Lighthouse Keeper's Cottage. So they must have warehouses full of paper on everybody else's stuff. I was a gobsmacked. And in one of those boxes is the visitor's book. And so you've got to go online and order these things and say, I'm going to be there on a day and I want to look. I'm a researcher. Pulled this book out, and it's leather bound with a satin thing through it, and you open it up and kids have scribbled on it on the inside. But the first visitors signed their names in that book on the 5th of September 1884. And of the 6 to 10 names that are in there, 3 are Webbers and 3 are Wellses, including my great-grandfather, the husband of Maria, who I think became a lighthouse keeper. Certainly one of the Webbers was a lighthouse keeper for a period of time. The Wellses were too busy chasing sheep. But they all fronted that day and said, this is a good thing, and all signed the book. So that was a fascinating piece of history for me and for my family. And showed the respect and value of that. That was for them what the road was for the generation of the 50s. That sense of safety and ability to travel and undertake commerce. The lighthouse keeper's cottage and someone caring for that light was a huge part of that. And I think I sent you a picture of that steamer go roaring through there, you know. But boats came unstuck.
They still do.
They still do, and I think it was the Pyramide stuck a snout up there one day. I've seen one of my vessels in my time at Sea Lord got a fright in there because my brother saw it get a fright in there. Had looked at the wrong month in the tide tables.
Oh, tide. Yeah.
It might have been the wrong year because they put more than 1 year in the tide tables. Doesn't take much. My grandfather went through there once to drop some people at the French Pass with guests, people staying, and they got in there, and this was in the old Kawa, which was these very low horsepower sounds boats that 2 speeds, damn slow and stop, used to be the joke. Yeah. I know there would have been 3.5, 5 horsepower, something like that, very limited horsepower and shaped like a canoe. Got in there and got swung by the tide onto the reef in the middle of the pass, and kind of swung around backwards, and a passenger of the female persuasion got a bit excitable and jumped down and landed up to her knees on the rocks and got hauled back in, and they made their way off. But it's not a place to jump out.
No.
even if it looks bad. But
yeah.
That passage through there has drowned surveyors and various people. It's drowned people who have been recreating in there, tragically. As we know, in more recent times, my grandmother... I never met my grandfather. He died of cancer from chain smoking, they'd call it PTSD from World War I now, but he's a heavy smoker, and that did for him before I ever had a chance to speak to him. But my grandmother said, I spent my life in Waikawa Bay, and one year because of bad weather, I never left the bay for a year, because every time we had a plan to go somewhere, the weather was bad, and that was just the nor'westerly ruled your life. And if it blew nor'west, you didn't go anywhere. And some years it blows nor'west a lot.
Yep.
And people forget that, because it hadn't been bad the last while, but it's back on now actually. But it's been a long time of not much. But she said the time she was most fearful for her husband was when he and the shepherd on the farm would take the wool from the wool shed, which was on the beach. Everything was on the beach because it was all boat transport, and they'd put a bale or 2 bales of wool in what they called a surf boat, which is a glorified clinker dinghy, almost like a whaling, halfway between a whaling boat and a 12-foot clinker dinghy. They're probably 15, 20-foot boat, and you could row them with 2 sets of oars. I think they used to put a wee mast in. I remember a stag skin being used for a sail once by my dad on a smaller dinghy. But they would row out into the current basin from Waikawa, which is 2 hours straight out, and run with the tide down through the pass with 2 bales of wool on the boat, and use the derrick and put it up on the wharf and into the old wharf shed, waiting for the scow, one of the old scows or the steamer to come and pick it up. And they'd do that over a few days, and they'd have to wait there, I assume, for the tide. They're never going to row back and run back with the tide. And my grandma said she waited all day for them to return, and because that was the only time they had to get involved with the sea, really. The fishermen doing it every day, but they only did it when they were shifting that wool. And she said that was the only time she truly was frightened for them, was that she'd watch them go around the corner and then wait, and because fishermen's wives do that every day. But it brought home to me that those risks they had to take, but how important the wharf was, how important the ferries were, and how important boat building was. And I see that photo of the old kawa and that surf boat alongside it, and they lived in those things. Great anecdote about boats. They'd row to the next bay to do all their mustering and stuff. No roads, too far to walk, too steep for horses. So they put the dinghies down, 1 or 2 of these big dinghies. They're beautiful dinghies, easy to row. People think, how do you row so far? But they had boats that you could row.
Designed
not these pieces of rubbish you got now. They just go round circles, right? More work you put into them, the less distance you go. But they put the dinghies down. It was blowing a light southeast, so a perfect day to go around there and do this work. And the dogs used to love it. So all the sheepdogs would run up and down the beach. Well, they let the sheepdogs off, and about 4 of them went racing down and jumped into the dinghy ready to roll. And their momentum was enough to push the dinghy off.
Oh.
So there's 4 dogs looking over the transom.
No one's rowing.
As they're heading out the bay, there's no one in it. And the dinghy's heading off out the bay with the dogs in it. And the old man's tearing around trying to find another boat to get out so he can go and capture them and bring them back, which he achieved. But we did lose one dinghy. We went all the way to Farewell Spit in the southeast once, so it hadn't been secured properly. Leaving a dinghy down the beach below the high tide mark was a criminal offence in our house.
That was a clip around the ears.
Absolutely.
I think we've sort of, you take it for granted, like it said, like a simple thing like a wharf and boats. And I guess for those viewers that don't understand that, I think it's important to have a look at it online. It's where 2 bodies of water meet in a very narrow channel. And there's whirlpools, there's huge tides. Some vessels literally can't get through it, like large vessels like this. If there's a spring tide, they can't get through it. They've got to wait for the tide to go with it. And it's funny what you mentioned, Richard. Like this boat, the Gleam's been through there a gazillion times.
Yep.
All weather, doesn't matter what time of the day or night. And Dad's been through it a gazillion times. And I remember as a young fella, quite often, particularly when you're heading to the north going through and you're tucking close to the actual lighthouse on the shore. And
just
you're
about
right.
touch it.
That's right.
With a broom anyway.
And you talk about the gape and the muscles. You can see the muscles are open. And a few times I remember toes are all curled up. But of course, what you do is you avoid the tide.
Yep.
So and then
you're coming in on the back eddy.
That's right. You just come in and then it's smooth as, and you just pop out
Duck
the other side,
the
and you go through that run of tide, probably only 20 feet long. And I know, like, there was all sorts of talk. When they were kids, there's all sorts of silly things that people used to row out there. And I remember that was Darren Guard talking about they used to, when they had slightly bigger boats, they'd throw 44-gallon drums in the whirlpool for fun and just watch them disappear. They'd just go, get sucked down, never to be seen
Called
again.
Jacobson's Hole.
Yeah,
From the famous Jacobson family down there.
Absolutely. So they did all sorts of things, but they definitely treated it with respect.
There were some young fellas that apparently used to run through the Fisherman's Passage on the other side in dinghies, lying down on the floor of the dinghy and just let themselves be sucked through. I won't name them, but that was a popular sport for those undertaking it, but not for the families involved, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, nowadays you got base jumping and parachuting, and that was the equivalent back then, wasn't it? So I've noticed, Richard, that you've got something sitting next to your arm there that I've been looking at, thinking it's nice and shiny.
I do,
and that would look really good on the Gleam. So tell us the history behind that, and what's that all about?
I'll tell you my history. I've had to make a history for this up. But I do a lot of reading, as much reading as I can, and establish facts, and then I build in other bits around it. And so it might be myth, it might not. But shipping tragedies, in 1894, a bark named the Gazelle came around D'Urville Island, and it had come from the Pacific, and the captain had died, either of a heart attack or a stroke or disease or something, but it was under the command of the mate at the time, and was uninsured. There's lots of newspaper stories about it. Quite a big ship, iron hull, but 3-master, so not small, and carrying guano, or bird poo as we know it, fertiliser back then. And she came around D'Urville, and in a screaming nor'west, like we now get because of climate change, but they got back then just because it was bloody windy, and blew the sails out of her. And I'd always sort of thought that it actually hit the beef barrels, which has caught many vessels, including at least one big one. But no, they just lost control of the ship. All the sails were in tatters. They may have been reasonably poorly looked after, not a well-kept boat, wasn't insured, as a hint. And so they just blew out of control straight in from that southern end of D'Urville towards what we call the point, but it's the headlands between Waikawa Bay and Okuri Bay, with Okuri being open to Tasman Bay and Waikawa Bay looking straight into the current basin in D'Urville Island, so that's relatively enclosed water. So they just basically came careering in out of control on the masts, somewhere around the beef barrels, in a heavy, heavy nor'west at night. So they're in big trouble.
Pretty untidy. And
they slammed into the rocks, into the cliff face between the point that goes into Waikawa, which is a point with no name. It doesn't even have a name, and what we call Okuri Point, which is on the eastern side of Okuri Bay. And very, very steep and precipitous there, and they just smashed straight into the rocks in this heavy sea. And so they all piled off, and nine men drowned, and they were beaten to pieces. And the newspaper report talks about how bad shape their bodies were in, because they all ended up, most of them, some were never found, but most of them ended up on the beach in Waikawa. So my great-grandfather, he was there, and picking up the pieces, basically. And the first he would have known about it was people washing up on the beach. And stuff washing up on the beach. And one of the stories from Grandma was he walked down the beach and there's a person sitting on the rocks, upright like I'm sitting here, and he called out to this guy, and they never answered, and he was dead. He was just, the tide had left him in a sitting position. That was a real shock for him. Wow. But one person turned up on a deck hatch, the mate of the bosun, can't recall, so I won't make stuff up, but he's one of the officers, and he was in the newspaper report says he was revived by massaging and application of brandy. So grandfather basically rubbed him back to health. He would have been hypothermic and in shock and been floating around. So he was just, by some luck, the wave action, you get that refraction back from the cliffs, must have pushed him back out to sea, and he floated around the corner and ended up on the beach in Waikawa. But the real story, and we'll get to the doorknob in a minute, was a guy called Quintal, and he was part of the ship's crew. He was from the Pacific somewhere, quite an unusual name. It's vaguely Portuguese. And he was a pearl diver, or had been, and he could swim. You could guarantee you none of the rest of the crew could swim.
A rare thing back then to be able
When
to
the
swim.
vessel struck, they all headed for shore. Quintal dived off the weather side and swam out to sea all night. And he swam and swam and swam and swam and stayed off until daylight, and then made his way in. And right where the Gazelle hit the cliff, and I've seen a vague sort of outline of the hull many years ago when I was a child, in very, very clear water at a very, very low tide. From the boat, you could look down and you could actually see kind of where it was. There's a wee cove, very, very narrow, very steep, like a little smuggler's cove that collects driftwood and stuff. And he was able to swim into there, and grandfather, after he'd been alerted to this, great-grandfather, this disaster, he walked out to the front of the point. It was about a 3-mile walk from the homestead, and found Quintal curled up in a barrel, asleep, stuffed. So they were the survivors, and that point's called Quintal Point. So the family, we've named that place. So we call the paddock on the farm Quintal Point, and that was a razorback precipice there. So that's Quintal Point, named in memory of that guy, and he was lucky, he got away with it. But lots of stuff came off that boat.
As they do. There's lots of bits.
And washed up, I think. I don't think they ever actually got at the wreck because it broke up against the cliff. But I know that a teak table is in the possession of one of my cousins, and that came off the ship. We had a wood box on the back veranda, which I always wanted, a long, narrow seat with a lift-up lid, and thought it looked almost like a church pew, but with compartments under it. And I always wondered about it. And then one day I thought, that came off a ship. You know, everything's narrow and space is constrained, and you put cupboards in the Gleam. I bet you can lift that seat up there.
Absolutely.
It is, right? So it was one of those, but longer. We used it as a wood box. It would have come off the Gazelle almost certainly. There was a funny brass latch on the gate up to the chook house, which was different to everything around the place. I always looked at it. I suspect that came off the Gazelle, and I'm pleased to say my niece has got it. But this doorknob was on a shed up the hill by an old, like a dock hut that my grandfather used as a jump-off point when he was farming at the far end of the farm. It was too far to walk each day, no road. So they had to go up there, and they kept horses. So they kept the pack horses tack, and they used to do a bit of ploughing and stuff. And this doorknob was always on the door of that shed. And I never took much notice of it. And over time, the shed disintegrated because we were careless about looking after stuff. And I regret that now. But I remember then one day it dawned on me. It's got a ring in it. And
ships.
It's a ship's doorknob. To run a rope in heavy weather, I assume, you'd run a rope round the outside, around a companionway, around the wheelhouse or the forecastle, so that in heavy weather you've got something to hang on to. So, and it's entirely made out of brass. All the mechanism, all the screws, there's not a piece of steel in it. That's a ship's doorknob.
Definitely a ship's doorknob.
So I'm saying it came from the Gazelle, but that's just me saying that.
It makes perfect
no one's
sense.
told me it does, but it fits in time and in style, and I love it, and I've never had anything good enough to put it on. There's an interesting number of very old dents in that side of the doorknob, so I don't know what was going on inside the cabin at times. But that ring's is a giveaway. I think the little metal bit there that grandfather made that so it didn't sink into the wood. I think that's another relic of the Gazelle. The sextant was found. Other parts of it have been found by dive teams. I think Nelsh Dive Club dived it a bit. So there's artefacts from the Gazelle around the place, and there's a picture of it in Olive Baldwin's book about French Pass. I went looking for the original but couldn't find it at the Maritime Museum in Wellington. But that was 9 men died. So you go to Papers Past, and every newspaper in the country was talking about it. The boat was uninsured. 9 people died. My grandfather saved one guy, definitely. The other guy saved himself by his ability to swim. Lesson there for people. The 9 people that died were badly knocked about, and grandfather had the nasty job of building them coffins, and he buried everyone. I think it was 4 or 6 that turned up on the beach. He buried them, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, the police came down and exhumed them and took them away. But he just had to do what he had to do, so he put them in the ground. Must have been a tough time.
Yeah, you dealt with things back then that we couldn't even imagine or dream about, and I guess that's that's sort of one of many vessels that have gone aground
Yes.
or perished in that sort of area around French Pass.
Been
and
lucky.
Okuri. Yeah,
Been
there's
lucky.
been a lot of lucky people.
Big one went up the beach at Te Puna and most of the people got off on D'Urville. The Gale at Okuri Light, she did hit the beef barrels, I think. Dad said there was apples in the water forever. That was much later on. She was motorboat, I think, but quite big.
Yeah,
and there's another one that's at the beef barrels. I can't remember the name. But,
it's been a few, and I guess that's a message to any recreational fishers that fish around, Current Basin or French Passes. Treat it with respect, and that's sort of a nasty bit of water, and braver and tougher men than us have perished. Really,
there's been 2 yachts sinking in Okuri Bay in my time, a trimaran and one much more recently. There at times they shouldn't be. Seeking shelter on Okuri Bay in a northerly, a gale northerly, can't happen.
It's a pretty common thing, isn't it?
But I've got to say, for the number of boat traffic we see, we get off pretty lightly. There's really good weather reports now, and I know like we watch the Okuri Bay set come up, and in a southerly they all come up. That's the time to be there. And a southwest and a westerly northwest they stay home, and it's no excuse for the weather reports we've got now. But it's unforgiving if you make a mistake.
Yeah.
No doubt.
No, absolutely. No, that's bloody fascinating, and I know a lot of the viewers will be keen on that. We might have to start a shipwreck series or something, Richard, but that'll take a bit of a
our local man runs the dive service down here. He'll know a thing or two about that.
Yeah, Bruce Lyons here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he definitely would. So look, you've got, and we will get you back on to do another one around, your bird work and your marine mammals. So I know you've been involved.
I caught a lot of fish
too
there. I've got to put that in there. And I was that was a good time for me.
Yeah, I guess that is a good point. I guess because you've gone from fishing to conserving protected species and all those things, as every fisherman.
But I do lump fishermen in with protected species. So the work I've done have always been set fishermen up to succeed. I've wanted to see them survive and be able to validate their business and their lifestyle and their income. And improving conservation work is a part of that. So I've always done it in the belief that the seafood sector and conservation objectives should be able to work together. So it was, to me, I wasn't protecting fishermen, but I was trying to ensure they had the opportunity to be able to continue their good work and produce that primary food production, which I really value as a whole proposition. But be able to, that it was defensible, that what they were doing the best they could in terms of that conservation stuff. And all I know is they're all acknowledging it and doing a far better job than they did when I was a hairy, big-coated, just out of school boy of 1920 on the dear old Tequila, running around with the Havelock Mafia, where that was not something we even thought about. We thought about catching scallops and finding interesting things on the beach and spinning yarns. So the industry's matured and come a long way. It sees the bigger picture. It's great. It's a great news story.
Yeah, absolutely, a lot of changes for sure. But what's next for you? Because you've recently retired. What's the big plan for Richard? It sounds like, to be fair, there probably should be the odd book written and the odd movie made, and we'll definitely get you back to do another podcast on your on your protected species stuff. But what's the future looking like for Richard?
I'm still dabbling in fisheries work, just small jobs, jobs where I feel I can help and support. I know stuff, so I can be a part of a job where I don't have to write 50-page reports, but I can, from my experience and learnings, I can help make that report a good report. Doing a bit of work in Australia, desktop stuff at the moment, for an Australian fisheries aspect of fisheries over there, where they want some outside eyes to have a look. But it's 5 or 6 days, so it's not a real grind. It's really interesting work. Pleased to be a part of it. So I'm still on call doing bits and pieces. I still do I do a Fisheries 101 training presentation, which is like a 3-hour, everything I've learnt in 30 years, for young up-and-comers in the fishing industry. And I often deliver that at FishServe Seafood New Zealand building, because they're all there in a hub now. So all of their new people, their new employees, can get a once-over lightly. How does trawling work? What do we do to protect birds? What's the quota management system mean? The whole sort of landscape's very complicated to try and bring them into that. So I deliver that for nothing. If I'm in Wellington, I just say, because I just want to see new people in the industry have a reasonable understanding of the baselines and stuff. So I do that. I've been involved in deer stalkers and stuff, quite a lot of voluntary organisations. I'm just stepping out of that because I do want to do what you've just described. I'm vice chair of French Pass Residents, because I'm looking after the road like my grandfather and my father. That's the only not-for-profit that I'll be involved in over the next period of time. But I've got my great uncle's memoirs, Lewis Wells. So he was son of one of the Maria's brothers. Their family lived at Ohana on D'Urville for a long period of time. They were in Waikawa for a bit. All the Wells were in Waikawa. There's 3 or 4 brothers there, but they spread out. And Lewis he grew up at Ohana, Waikawa initially, then Ohana, and then Manawa Kapi over on the front side of D'Urville, right? Everyone calls it Kapi because Manawa Kapa.
Yeah, it's too hard. It's a tongue twister. I remember as a kid, Dad said it's Kapi, and I remember saying on the chat, it's not, Dad, it's Manawa Kapi. He goes, it's bloody Kapi, boy. I go, Dad,
it's the
Kapi.
sound of birds flying. It's Kapa means clapping. Manu's bird, so it's the clapping of wings.
Yeah.
There were so many birds lived there, which tells
true.
you something we've lost. And as a conservationist, I feel that now. But anyway, he wrote his memoirs, and they've recently come into my hands. And he's really talked about what happened down there between 1875 and about 1930, and it's extraordinary. And so I've got the transcript, and I've got permission from the nearest living relatives to publish that. So some of those photos I've shown you, he talks about. Yeah. So I could talk to you, the people here today, about those sports events and those flower arranging courses and stuff.
Yeah.
Because of what he wrote, not because I knew it. I just had the photos and could only guess. So I'm going to put all that together as a package and actually publish it as a purchasable book as a first step to getting some of that history anchored. And I'll take the chance because I'm going to remember right now, you collecting these oral histories is valuable work. Thank you. I've been watching all of them. I noted that I was either related to or had worked with 90% of all the people you're talking to, including yourself, which shows what a lovely, tight community it is. But, the gathering of this stuff's so important and because it keeps and it's available for historians and stuff. But then I want to do my own memoirs because both my grandfathers died before I could talk to them. And my dad's died now, but I've got a good memory and I'm going to get their stories, tall tales and true. Some of it's anecdotal, some of it's all anecdotal, some of it's apocryphal. They're stories that should have been true, if you like, because they fitted the scene. Some of them are true stories. So what they remember from the 1900 through, get that down before I forget, and then write my own, because so much of it's so similar because our world never changed, and I'll write mine up until the time electricity arrived. And that was when I was at boarding school. So in the 70s, electricity arrived at French Pass and we became normal society, in my view. People who drive out there probably think it still doesn't look normal, but it normalised it. Yeah. And so, but before then we lived a different lifestyle, far closer to what the pioneers lived. You had to have chooks, you killed a pig once a year, you killed a sheep once a week, you couldn't freeze anything. If you caught cod, if the cod were biting, you caught 12 and smoked them, or you only caught 2 because it's all you could keep. Everything revolved around collecting firewood. It was a subsistence, primitive society, even with vehicles, relatively unchanged. We never drove anywhere on the farm without throwing firewood in the back of the Land Rover because it was our heat and it heated our hot water, and if you didn't light the fire, you couldn't cook and you couldn't have a bath. Yeah. Real primal basic stuff that's missing today, unfortunately. Keeps you honest. So that's what I want to write about, because that's what was different for me to so many people now, and I've only just realised that when other people look at that, their eyebrows shoot up because it's so different. Well,
it's the way we grew up, and it's probably the way that I see some people are moving back towards that. They
hack for it. Yes.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a desire there, but it's hard yards, and I think it'll be.
It's drudgery, mate.
Yeah, it is.
It's drudgery.
You either work for money or you work to survive, right? So you're working for food and for warmth and for all of those things. So either way, you're working. So look, it sounds.
From the age of 5.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it sounds like you're going to be working just as hard in your semi-retirement as you did through your career. So, look, I want to thank you for coming, Richard, and we will do another one. So keep us in the loop with your with your memoirs and the book and all of those things, because I think that's really important. And thanks for the punt, because largely that's what we're doing here, right? I want to capture the history. I want to promote our industry with a few safety messages out there, and just let people celebrate the yesteryear. I mean, a lot of people are, wondering what the future looks like. The future will be what it'll be, but the past has been, we've had a lot of learnings.
Storms and deaths.
Absolutely.
And good things and bad things.
As it always has. And it's just normal part of the highs and lows of living as a human being. So thank you very much for coming, and I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invite. We'll be pleased to come back after everyone's had a chance to draw a breath. Thrilled that the old Gleam, despite the beautiful paint job and tart up, still smells like the old Gleam. They all smell different. Yeah. But they smell like a fishing boat.
Yeah, well, you'll notice that in your clothes when you leave. You'll still get that oily, diesely residue smell in your clothes. So,
that's the one.
So no, thank you very, very much for coming.
You're welcome.
So thank you. That was Richard Wells, which was an amazing piece of history for the local French Pass D'Urville Island. Please subscribe. We need you to do that so we can keep doing this and growing the channel. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.